Everybody, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to quickly talk about the different project types of the Entity Framework. Now, let's start. First, I talked about how to install the SQL Server, and you can see it over here. Then I talked about how to create the project in the Visual Studio and install the Entity Framework on it. Now it's time to creating the first application in the Entity Framework, but it's not possible yet. Why? Because we need to learn more about the project types of the Entity Framework. So let's dig in. Generally speaking, we have three main project types in the Entity Framework. The first one is database first, the next is model first, and the last one is code first. Each project type has its own benefits and weaknesses. So let's talk more about all of them one by one. Later we can decide which one is great for us. The first one is database first. Like its name, if you want to work with it, at the first step we need to create the database in the SQL Server and SQL Server Management Studio. After creating the database, we need to import it inside the Entity Framework project, and based on the database, the Entity Framework will automatically generate the model and the code. Then we can use the code and model for designing and creating our application. So what is the model and the code? Currently, I don't want to talk more about all of them because I'll talk about them in my upcoming tutorials. So don't worry about anything. For better understanding, let's open up my Google and search the entity model. You can see all of these, and if I scroll down here, I have one favorite, and this is the simple model. Indeed, the model is a kind of a schema or a kind of diagram that are created based on the tables inside the database and the relationship between your tables inside the SQL Server database. So the model is a kind of diagram of the database. And based on the model, we can create the codes of the Entity Framework. So you can see it over here. After creating the codes based on the models, we can create our application easily and quickly. So the first step is creating the database, then auto-generating the model and the code. Fortunately, generating the code and model is completely automatic and automatically will done by the Entity Framework itself. Then we need to create the application by using the code and the model. I love this method, and indeed it is my favorite method. And the next one is entity model. In this method, first of all, we need to open up the model designer in the Visual Studio and in our application, then create our model and the relations between them. After creating the model, we can automatically generate the code and the database. After this step, we can create our application by using the code and the model and the database. So in this method, the first step is creating the entity model or the diagram of my application and the database. Then the code and database will automatically generate by the Entity Framework, and after that we need to create the application. This method is my second favorite one, and I love it after the database first. And this was the model first. And the last one, and the too complex one indeed, is the code first. In this method, we need to write everything from scratch in the entity code. And based on the entity code, we can generate the model and the database. Later, we can use all of this for creating our application. So in this method, we need to create and write everything from scratch manually. Then based on the entity code, all of this will be done and we can create the application. Indeed, this method is really complex and time consuming. And personally, I don't love it because the programmers are responsible for everything and should create and write the code from scratch for everything in the application and the project. So I don't love it, and I prefer to use first of all the database first, then the model first. And if I can't find any of the methods, then the last option for me is the code first. So this was the quick tour about the different project types of the entity framework. And here you can see the green checkbox, and it means this method is my favorite one. The database first. Hello database first, what's up? And my second option is the model first. And you can see the alert over here. And the last one that I never try to think about it is the code first. Okay, excellent. Currently, we'll learn more about the project types of the entity framework. Now it's time to create our application. And the first step in this method is the database. So we need to create the database. As the result in my upcoming tutorial, I'll start to create the database in the SQL Server Management Studio. In the first step of the database first method of the entity framework. It's really amazing and great creating the database. So don't hesitate to join me. I'm waiting for you. Thanks for your time.